There is a Celtic saying that I'm sure many of you know that says that heaven and earth are only 3 feet apart, but in the thin places, that distance is even smaller. Heaven and earth are only 3 feet apart, but in the thin places, that distance is even smaller. And poet Helen Sledge gives this description of thin places. Thin places, the Celts call this space, both seen and unseen, where the door between the world and the next is cracked open for a moment, and the light is not all on the other side. The door's cracked open for a moment, and the light's not all on the other side. It's on this side as well. All Saints' Day is, I think, a thin place, a thin-placed kind of day. A day when we feel that we can reach through that barrier of time and space and touch our loved ones whom we see no more. If we come today remembering someone who died recently, our sorrow might be pretty acute, and that's okay. If we remember someone whom we lost long ago, then our sorrow returns, and that's okay. Or maybe we're just pleased to have a moment to focus and remember, and so we're not so much sorrowful as hopeful and peaceful, and that's okay as well. I've been spending some time over the last couple of weeks discovering stories of people whom I didn't know, but who were known by this church, who were known by this space. I've been researching the 51 soldiers who are memorialised on our walls, and the 3 whose names were inadvertently left off. We walk past their names at the entrance to the church every time we walk in, but usually I think we walk past without a second thought. Every now and then there's a poppy placed on the memorial, and so we know that someone has come and stopped to remember. Next Sunday, of course, is Armistice Day, 100 years since the end of World War I. And so in preparation for that service, I've been researching the names and finding myself in one of those thin places. When the memorial was dedicated on the 27th of February 1921, the Bishop of Auckland said, "We know that those brave heroes are not lying in scattered graves, but that they form a part of that encompassing crowd of witnesses who have passed from death to life under the leadership of the great captain, and they are leading a fuller and higher existence." It's not really the kind of language that we use these days, although we had that kind of language in our opening hymn, the old traditional For All the Saints. But that phrase, the crowd of witnesses, is a phrase from St. Paul that we often use on All Saints' Day to think of ourselves joining with the saints, the crowd of witnesses. And St. Paul said we're all saints, not just the super holy, super perfect ones. He used saints to mean the ordinary people who belong to the community, the church. Also back in 1921, on the dedication day of the memorial, the Governor-General, Lord Jellicoe, said, the call of arms was obeyed by the glorious dead whose memory was perpetuated by this memorial. They had answered the call of duty to God, to the King, to the Empire, and to themselves. Again, how strange that language sounds to us today. Thinking about king and empire and thinking about going to war as being a call of God. History has taught us the futility and waste of World War I, the trenches, the massacre at Gallipoli. Over 18,000 deaths from our population of just 1 million. Everyone knew someone who had died, and so no wonder there are 51 names listed just in this one church. The vestry at the time decided that the marble tablets would be erected in the church and that they would contain the names of all from St. Matthew's parish who have fallen, irrespective of their denomination. and the names of others who have been associated with St Matthew's in any way. So even in the 1920s, St Matthew's was a place for all. To be willing to name anyone of another denomination in those days was just a little bit radical. So that's why we have so many names on our plaque. The vicar at the time was Reverend William Gillam. He took leave from the parish to be a chaplain in the war and did 3 tours of duty. When he first left to serve in 1915, the parish threw a big party and showered him with gifts. He was sent, though, to serve on the hospital ship Mahino at Gallipoli. He returned to a hero's welcome, but when he left again in 1916, he said there was to be no farewell, no celebration at all. He'd seen, of course, by then the horrors of tending to the wounded and performing countless burials. He returned quite diminished and unwell, never regaining his full strength. Towards the end of the war, his son Floyd was killed, and his name is on the memorial. Reverend Gillam retired in 1919, and when he died in 1929, his ashes were placed in the pillar over there where the consecration stone is. There's a plaque on the front where you can read that. I didn't know that until I did this research, that he is buried in our pillar. How often do we hear that comment that those returning soldiers never wished to speak of the war, certainly never wished to celebrate it? How many of our ancestors have told us that families only discovered after their death diaries or letters recounting what really happened? Families at the time never really got to hear the whole story, recounting the tragedy and the horrors. And how hard it must have been for them to marry up the official language of serving king, empire, and God with the sheer agony of what they had been asked to do. Imagine those returning soldiers who came back, gathering for the opening of the memorial and hearing the kind of rah-rah language of the bishop and the governor-general. It must have been such a disconnect for them. I think that would have been quite unbearable. And I think that's maybe why so often they just did not speak. Would they be pleased, I wonder, that we remember them 100 years later? Would they be pleased that we want to reach through the barrier of time and touch their stories? I'm sure they would ask us, what have we learnt? And what do we do differently 100 years on? And we would have to confess the wars that have been waged, and we would have to confess the lack of peace and justice in our world still. The passage that we read from the book of Revelation today would have been one that was read often during the war, I'm sure. Reverend Gillam and his fellow chaplains would have read it at funerals or to comfort the dying. The home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them as their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. Did that help them, I wonder? Would it have helped them to hear the reading about Lazarus being raised from the dead? Would that have helped them? Did they understand that God was on no side in the war, but that God was with the suffering and the pain, and that God was yearning for it to be over? When we hear those words, death will be no more, mourning and crying and pain will be no more, do those words help us? Can we hear that God is not in some faraway place, but here among mortals, here in our joys and in our sorrows? The book of Revelation is the kind of book that's full of strange visions and strange tales, and it seems quite impenetrable to us sometimes. But here right at the end it says, the home of God is among mortals, not in this great visionary place of heaven that is described in other places in the letter, but here, amongst us. The book of Revelation was written at a time of suffering and persecution for the early Christians, so the words are not sweet words designed to cheer us up. They are real words, burnished with the suffering that was very real. Thin places, the Celts call this space, both seen and unseen, where the door between the world and the next is cracked open for a moment, and the light is not all on the other side. The light is not all on the other side. The light is here, where God is present among mortals, dwelling with us, wiping tears from our eyes. And for that, we can be thankful.